avaliação biomecânica no alto rendimento, a ser proferida pelo professor Dr. Trent Nessler, oriundo dos Estados Unidos da América. Lembramos aos presentes que as perguntas direcionadas aos palestrantes deverão ser entregues por escrito aos militares que as recolherão durante a apresentação. Leitura do currículo vitae resumido. Professor Dr. Trent Ray Nessler. Professor Trent é fundador e CIO da Accelerated Conditioning and Learning. É bacharel em Fisiologia do Exercício, mestre em Fisioterapia e doutor em Fisioterapia. É editor associado do International Journal of Athletic Therapy and Training, membro do USA Chair Safety Council, chefiou um programa de medicina esportiva composto com 50 high school, 8 colleges e 3 equipes profissionais, e é criador do método DMA, Dynamic Movement Assessment, ao qual tem um mini curso sendo realizado paralelamente ao nosso simpósio. Com os senhores, professor Trent Nessler.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you very much. It is truly an honor to be here today to present to all of you what has really been a passion in my life for the last 12 years. As a physical therapist and a clinician, I have seen way too many kids getting injured. What I'm going to be showing you today has been accumulation of the last 8 years of research as well as development in what we have brought to you and presenting to you today. I always like to show people what our mission statement is. The reason I like to show what our mission statement is because of one word on here, profoundly. We want to profoundly reduce athletic injuries. To profoundly reduce athletic injuries, you have to think outside the box. I'm going to present to you research from 2012, 2013, and 2014. But many of these studies are repeats of what was published in 1998, 2000, 2005. But yet the standard of practice, the way that we practice in the USA, is no different. And so we have to think outside the box and do something completely different than the way that we're currently approaching. And I'm really excited to share with all of you an advancement in technology that we're launching to the market in this December. I also have a disclaimer on here. None of these videos, none of these pictures are altered in any way. This is how your athletes move. You will see pictures of high school athletes, high-level college athletes, Olympic athletes, and professional athletes. And I use that spectrum to show how people move, no matter what level of athlete that they are. This is how your athletes move. This type of movement is associated with increased risk for injury. In the U.S., this adds to 250,000 A.C.L. injuries every single year in high school athletes. But these are not just movements that are associated with athletics. These same motions are also associated with increased injuries in military personnel. In the U.S. military, this adds to 8.3 million days of lost duty. It is movements like this that impact athletic performance. It is movements like this that alters kinetic energy transfer across the entire system. Studies show that if you can improve these types of movements, you can have a significant impact on athletic performance. In the U.S. military, over 50% of combat-related injuries are related to non-contact musculoskeletal injuries of the lower kinetic chain. Those are preventable injuries. Movements like this cost a lot of money. If you're an NBA basketball player and you blow your ACL, well, guess what? You get 66% of your salary. Whether you play or not, you're getting 66% of that salary. So it costs teams a lot of money. It costs military organizations a lot of money. It costs schools a lot of money. Just to give you an idea, the cost associated just with that 250,000 ACL injuries is a $5 billion healthcare cost in the U.S. alone. That does not include the 79% that have osteoarthritis in 12 years. It does not include the 20% that re-injure their ACL in 2 years. In the U.S. military, based on 2010 numbers, these same mechanics result in a $1.5 billion annual healthcare cost. These same mechanics that are associated with injuries in athletics. Working with professional athletes and college athletes is a lot of fun. But I did not get into that for this. I got into this because of kids. How do we reduce injuries in kids? This particular study, published in 2014, is changing the way that U.S. colleges recruit athletes. Scholarship athletes get money to go to school. Based on this data, if you have a knee injury or knee surgery prior to your college athletic career, you are at an 8-fold to an 800-fold increased risk of having surgery during your college career. That means that the school has given you money to play. That means the school is going to have to cover all of your healthcare costs associated with that. And that means that the college is not getting your athletic contribution to the team. Because one of the things that this study also showed is that those same athletes sit on the sidelines injured 50% more time than other athletes. This changes lives. A lot of these kids cannot get into college without a scholarship. So they not only lose on the ability to play athletics, but they lose future opportunities in life for higher education, let alone the fact that they also have a significant impact on future joint health. So there's also a huge impact on athletic performance. When you look at the research papers and you look at the percentages that are related to return to sport for athletics, related specifically to ACL reconstruction, those papers will tell you anywhere from 80 to 85% to 90% will return to sport. However, what you need to do is look and see how those papers define return to sport. Return to sport may be that you actually get back on the team, but you spend 50% of your time on the sidelines watching the game. It does not mean that you are playing at the same level of performance. And there was a study that was done in 2012 by McCullen, and what he showed was that only 43% of athletes returned to the same level of performance. Level of performance measured by vertical jump, sprint speed, and confidence. Now, that study has not received a lot of publicity, but it was published in 2012. It was a moon study, a very large moon study across the U.S. The validity of that study is very, very high. But most importantly, players know this. The NFL Players Association rated knee injuries the #1 concern among NFL football players in 2013-14 football season. Why is that? Because they know what the rest of us don't, and that is it ruins careers. Because they're not going to get back to that same level of performance. They're not going to get back to that same level of confidence, and it ruins their future earning potential. So this McCullen study looked at these factors: sprint speed, confidence, and vertical jump. And when you measure that, return to sport percentages are much different than what has typically been published as return to sport. So how do we assess this? How do we assess both the impact that it has on injuries, and how do we assess the impact on performance? Because we know that these mechanics impact both of these factors. Back as far as 2005, studies were published that showed that these mechanics were also associated with a decrease in athletic performance. Yet, very rarely do you hear that talked about in all of the studies. Why do we look at the lower kinetic chain? Simple. Because 70% of athletic injuries occur in the lower kinetic chain. And just as importantly, 80% of athletic performance is driven from the lower kinetic chain. So we did not design a movement assessment that is a full body assessment. When you're doing physicals for 250 military personnel or 250 athletes, whatever you do has to be efficient. If you're working in a U.S. clinic and you're seeing 12 to 18 patients a day, whatever you do has to be efficient. So knowing that efficiency is key, we felt that we needed to hit the big areas being the lower kinetic chain. So there's a lot of ways that we can assess this. You know, if we have $500,000 or $700,000, we can build a really nice, beautiful biomechanics lab. Or we can look at some of the new technologies that are out there, 2D technologies that are out there. There's a lot of free apps that are out there that we can download on our phone. We also have certain movement screens that we can currently do that are more eyeball, where we are actually using subjective measure of human movement. But they all have their drawbacks. First and foremost, the biomechanics lab. It's great. It is the gold standard, but it's way too expensive. Most clinics cannot afford that. And more importantly, when you get all of that data, what does it mean? And more importantly, how is it going to drive what I do with that athlete today? With these types of apps, the problem is that there is no standardized protocol. And there is a major limitation with a lot of the angles that are drawn on these types of apps. Multiple studies have shown that when you're drawing angles on a 2D app, that the accuracy of those angles is not very good. The other thing is that your angle of your camera greatly alters what you will see. If you think you see adduction in the frontal plane, if you're off at an angle, you may not be seeing adduction in the frontal plane. It's simply a limitation of the technology itself. And there's been a lot of question about certain movement screens that we use. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So let's take this case example. This particular case in the NFL, they use a particular screen. This particular athlete at NFL Combines scored a 17 on this test. On this test, that indicates that this athlete is not at risk. The same day, this same athlete did a vertical jump. This is how he looked when he did his vertical jump. I don't have to be a biomechanist to see there's something messed up there. I don't have to go through a movement screen to see that that is a major risk factor. Unfortunately, that was not caught and resulted in that. This is the Washington Redskins. This is RG3. Unfortunately, this is his blowing of his second A.C.L. wearing his knee brace. So are we measuring what we think we're measuring? In 2013, 2014, the NFL had 63 A.C.L. injuries. the highest number of ACL injuries ever recorded in the NFL. So there was a lot of debate in the NFL about why is that the case. Many said, well, you know what, it's because of the new concussion laws. Because the new concussion laws in the NFL, players are hitting lower. So we got to expect that their knees are going to be at greater harm. But when you look at the data, 66% of those injuries were non-contact in orientation. There was no contact with another player. That being said, previous years, it was 70%. So yes, maybe there was a 4% impact, but it was only 4%. So are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So before we decide how to measure, we have to know what to measure. And really looking at the research. And again, like I said, all of this research comes from 2012, 13, and 14. Many of these studies were published, previous studies, in 98, 2000, 2005. One thing that we know is that a lateral shift or a lateral displacement of the pelvis during a squatting motion alters load. It alters the force that is attenuated through the entire lower kinetic chain. It also changes force generation. It changes length-tension relationships. It changes an imbalance between quadriceps and hamstrings. This type of motion is directly correlated with risk. It loads one side more than the other. We also know that if you improve efficiency of this one motion, that you have a direct impact on vertical jump and sprint speed. So improving efficiency of this movement will not only reduce risk, but it will also have an impact on athletic performance. We also know that adduction in the frontal plane is one of the things that you must measure. Adduction in the frontal plane, as demonstrated here, is directly correlated to the adduction moment. According to Stearns and Powers 2014, measurement of this motion in the frontal plane is directly correlated to the adduction moment. It is that adduction moment that is directly correlated to ACL risk. We also know that asymmetry between your right side and your left side is a big risk factor. That if you have one side that is very, very strong and one side that's not, that you're at a much greater risk for injury. We also know that single limb performance is one of the best indicators for actual performance. So somehow we've got to be able to measure a squat. We have to be able to measure single limb performance. And we need to be able to compare the right side to the left side. We also know that single limb testing is a better indicator for risk. We know that adduction moments that are presented in single limb performance are very similar to those that are presented in sport. We also know that fatigue impacts this motion. We don't want to see what an athlete looks like when they step on the field. We want to see what an athlete looks like in the second half of the game. Because it's the second half of the game where they are at greatest risk. It is the second half of the game where performance issues are at their highest. We also know that the core plays a big part in performance. We know the core plays a big part in injury prevention. We know that if you can improve your core strength, you decrease your risk for injury and you improve your athletic performance. We know that if you improve core strength, you improve vertical jump. Very rarely do you hear that talked about. The studies have shown it, that if you can improve your core strength, you also reduce your risk for ACL injury. So how do we measure all of this in the frontal plane? How do we quantify all of this knowledge in a very meaningful way? Quite simply, We go to the research. We go to the people who are really smart and doing this stuff on a daily basis. And we say, okay, if you're measuring adduction in the frontal plane, how do you measure it in the biomechanics lab? It's not related to the cameras that are around. It's related to the movement that they are doing. And so what you find are some very common movements. And that's what we're going to start to get to. But the other thing that we need to realize is that these same movements are also associated with a lot of other injuries. Like is demonstrated here in a Major League Soccer player, a high-level college soccer player, a high school football player. These same motions are related to non-contact injuries of the hip. They're related to cam impingement of the hip. They're related to shear stress of the labrum in the hip. They're also associated with non-contact injuries of the ankle. And what the studies show is that if you improve these mechanics, that you reduce all lower kinetic chain injuries. But why do we look at performance? Because adduction in the frontal plane alters kinetic energy transfer. Adduction in the frontal plane can reduce total loaded lifted. Myers showed way back in 2005 that these mechanics are associated with performance measures, vertical jump and sprint speed. But you can see here is that as this athlete moved up in her weight, is that the mechanics on her right knee progressively increased. And any of us can see, and we know with a powerlifting movement, kinetic energy is very important. That is a loss of kinetic energy. So, it's not rocket science. They're simple movements. All we did is go to the research and said, what do they use to measure movement? And how do we put that together in a battery of tests? So the dynamic movement assessment itself consists of the full squat, the step-up test, a single leg squat test, a single leg hop test, a plank test, side plank test right, side plank test left. All of these movements are done one right after the other. This is a physically intensive test. For military personnel, for athletes, their sport is physically intensive. I don't want to see what they look like when they get on the field. I want to see what they look like after they've been on the field. Our average athlete rates this an 8 out of 10. It is that physically intensive, but it's intended to be that way. I want to do this in a controlled environment so that I can see where do they break down so they're not breaking down on the field. With this assessment, we actually have two that we do. We have the dynamic movement assessment, which is for our high school athlete up to our lower level college athlete. And then we have a more intense version that actually combines this with a fatigue protocol. We do that for our very high level college athletes, our Olympic athletes, and our pro athletes. When this is combined with the fatigue protocol, our average athlete rates it an 8 out of 10. Again, it is very physically intensive. So just a little bit on some of our current research that is ongoing. This is a study that we are doing in the U.S. With the Andrews Institute and ASMI, which is American Sports Medicine Institute. And basically what we did is we used the dynamic movement assessment as a part of pre-participation physicals. So we evaluated all of these female soccer players prior to participation in their sport. Based on their results, we grouped them in 4 different groups based on their risk, based on how bad their movement was, based on how bad their asymmetry was. We grouped them in the 4 groups. We then put them in a group exercise. In this group exercise, we did a pre-practice routine that we did before their practice. We call that a neuromuscular resetting. It took 5 minutes. At the conclusion of their practice, we did a fatigue routine, a strengthening routine. That took 15 to 20 minutes. So the total exercise time was between 15 and 25 minutes. Not that long, but we were using their practice as part of that fatigue component. The other thing that we did with this is we partnered our athletes together. So a lot of our exercises, we instruct our athletes in what the movements are so that they are able to recognize it in each other. And then a lot of our exercises are grouped together. So two athletes are challenging each other with these exercises. And the reason I point that out is because with developing it in that way, we had a huge team psychological impact. The entire team built stronger, better relationships, which pulled the entire team together because they were working with each other on helping each other improve their movement and reduce their risk for injury. So this is our data so far, and I'm going to be the first to tell you that 100% reduction of non-contact ACL injuries is not statistically significant. If we only look at ACL injuries, we will have to continue this study for another 10 years. But what we are doing is comparing our data to the previous 10 years. Previous 10 years of data. I don't have a cell phone. It's comparing to the previous 10 years of data. The other thing that so knowing that clinically is not that significant, what we also looked at is all other lower kinetic chain injuries. So we looked at all non-contact injuries from the ankle all the way up to the lumbar spine. And what we found is a 58% reduction in all other lower kinetic chain injuries. But we didn't stop there because we know that healthcare cost is a big issue for colleges. So we actually tracked claim submissions and we tracked healthcare costs. Over a 2-year period, we saved the university $200,000. In college athletics, that adds significantly to their budget. So we also, on the final side, is we measured how many days on the DL. And what we saw was a significant drop in the number of days on the DL. But if you look at it, it makes a lot of sense. Because the main injuries that we reduced were non-contact hip surgery, non-contact ACL surgery, non-contact ankle surgery. When you reduce surgical cases, obviously, the number of days that someone spends on the disabled list is much less. So all of our movement assessment was created in a 2D environment. But we knew that it had a lot of limitations. We knew that we needed to find a way that we did this, that it was better. We knew that when we would teach people how to do this, that there was still a reliability issue. The inter and intra-rater reliability. We had a lot of issues with that. We also know that when people would interpret the data, there would be variations in the way that they interpret the data. That would lead to changes in corrective exercises that they would perform. And really, quite importantly, is efficiency. Because when you're doing military physicals, college physicals, pro physicals, whatever it is, the process has to be efficient. So how do we do that? And how do we create a test that is more sensitive? Because we knew that we were compromising sensitivity for efficiency when we developed our movement assessment. We had people score the worst repetition. But we knew that we were losing all of that sensitivity with all of the other repetitions. So how do we capture all of that? And that's really through the use of technology. Last Friday, Microsoft released this new camera. This is the Kinect version 2. The Kinect version 2 has been in development for about 2 years. In early 2014, we were one of 100 companies worldwide that were given access to the code to program this camera. So what it's allowed us to do is to program this camera to automate our entire movement assessment. Now, Microsoft says that this is a 3D camera. And if you go to any biomechanist who's got a biomechanics lab, they're going to tell you, is that really 3D? No. But what I will tell you is what it captures in the frontal plane is very accurate. In knowing that our movement assessment was designed off of 2D video, it allowed us to measure that in a very accurate and reliable way. So what it allows us to do is create a software, which is demonstrated down here, using this camera